everybody can hear me. I'm hoping that this microphone is working. I can't really tell, but really appreciate the time. This is my second time, and thank you, Shankar, and the CSA chapter here. Really a pleasure to come here and have another conversation with you all. I know last time, we almost went like 2-3 hours. I'm going to try not to do that to you all today. You know, we're gonna take advantage of some of this warm weather at the very least. But one of the elements here that I do want to talk about, make sure that this works here. Perfect. Is AI. You know, last time we talked about AI, it was a little bit of a, beginner strategy. You know, we had Super Bowl commercials, we had Microsoft Copilot, everybody needed it, nobody knew what it was. But at the end of the day now, here we are, fast forward, I believe it's a little over a year since I was able to speak to all of you. And we are starting to see now that AI is being massively adopted. There's more strategy behind it. There are steering committees. We understand the context of what we want to get out of it. I still think that there's pretty much a gap that exists because we don't know and haven't harnessed the full power of it yet. But in that context, what we have to consider as security practitioners is how are we going to protect our organizations while also enabling them to achieve the goals? We don't want to be at a race to the bottom. We want to be enablers so that we can really harness what AI has in front of us. And as part of, like, if anyone's looked at Rafiq's mind map of a CISO, AI right now has a very distinct call out, but it's just the latest technology, and guaranteed without question, quantum computing and things like that will be the next iteration of where we're going. Maybe some meld between the two, but nonetheless, we'll talk about what the risk landscape is, some of the considerations that you want to consider, what's available today to secure AI. And then we'll open up for Q&A. And at any point in time, obviously, this time is for you. So feel free to interrupt me, have conversations. This is the benefit of having a community like this to really learn from each other. So one of the things, and I stole this information. I was at a CISO Alliance, Millennium Alliance, it's called, event for the last couple days in Miami. And the CISO of 7-Eleven had a lot of various stats on the page. And this is just to represent where we sit within AI adoption today. One of the things that stood out was that the value of the global AI market that's expected to reach as much as $5 trillion by 2030. How many countries do you think have more than 4 million in GDP? How many? 3? 4? 4? 2. There's 2. Over 4 million. So if we start to consider the context of how AI then is going to be adopted, you've got a lot of different products, you have a lot of different vendors out there, you have infrastructure, we have a massive opportunity to take advantage of some of these things, but it's also going to be pushed onto our organizations, onto the boards, onto the executive teams to really adopt and harness this. So these are the types of areas that we need to start to consider, especially when we think about where we've been and where we are. 87% of global organizations believe AI technologies will provide a competitive edge. How many people in this room today working for a corporation haven't had some introduction of AI? No introduction of AI just yet? The other way. Yeah, the other way, exactly. I mean, that's the reality of where we're at. So, some of the fears as we sit and look at the 52% of the employed respondents express concern that AI will replace their jobs. I think that number used to be a lot higher. As we as humans need to harness it, understand it, especially as security practitioners, protect it. So one of the areas that I want to talk about today, and a lot of what we'll look at as the risk front end for AI, is 3 domains. And we'll be interweaving some of the topics around these 3 domains, but the AI copilots and chatbots. So Microsoft 365 or Copilot for 365 is probably the at least the Microsoft attempt at making that the Kleenex of AI chatbots, right? Everybody knows that there's tissues, there's Scott tissues, I'm a Scott, but everybody talks about, Kleenex at the end of the day. They really did have a capture on the market up front. It's something that's tangible. It's something that is in front of every single person at your organization utilizing Microsoft. It's from the mailroom to the boardroom, everyone's talking about it. What can it do? Well, early adopters kind of saw what it couldn't do. It's getting better, just like every other thing in software. But at the end of the day, these are the types of things that other vendors are going to be able to produce, as well as your own organizations building LLMs and your own specific chatbots to be helpful for you as an organization. The other piece is agentic AI. So Matthew McConaughey talks about, the agent force all the time with his all right, all right, all right approach. And that is something that when you really start to dig behind the curtain on it, it's still a decision tree. So we have data, we've got a person that's going to interact with this data. It's going to be able to do things like, for instance, if you're just getting your cable subscription started. Before you can have an installer show up, well, you need to have all the scheduling in place. Do we need a people or any person to be in between the consumer and the scheduler? Likely not, right? So we can make decisions, but it's making decisions based on what it's learned and what the data that's in front of them has. And then AI infrastructure. This is massive, massive data stores. How are we going to build our own LLMs? What are we going to get from an evaluation or evaluation position on innovation, on making tasks easier, on making the most of the data we have? Because I could go so far as to say everybody in every organization has a data retention policy, and roughly 0% of them are putting that into place by deleting data. And it's amazing to get into some of the environments and see data back from like 1990 and what have you. It's a different world. But nonetheless, as we talk about these things, this is the scenario that we are going to talk about where risk comes in. So two categories, and I'll bleed a couple other things in here, but I want to talk about the risk landscape and what that really looks like. So sensitive data leakage. At the end of the day, AI is data, data is AI, right? So without data, AI doesn't have any value. And when we think about all that context of data, when we have the purpose of, and this is very true of the agentic, it's very true of the LLMs, on the infrastructure side, it's very true of the chatbots, is that if we don't understand the data that is available to the chatbot, to the LLM, we could very easily expose sensitive data. Think about the context too today is that the hacks that are taking place, the breaches, this isn't the land and expand and get in, do reconnaissance and all the wild time, effort, and energy hacking that takes place. They're taking over an identity and they're logging in as one of us and they're going into a chatbot. We don't need to identify data anymore. We don't need to do mapping. What we need to be able to do is if they've got an AI agent, if they've got a chatbot, guess what? They're going to go in there and say, show me your sensitive information, and out it comes. So it's important to understand part of that as a risk of how are we going to control the data that our end users have, and what value does sensitive data really have in some of these interactions that you want to have with AI? Another risk, as we think about that same context, is the blast radius exploitation. So the blast radius, think about it in the context of bad actor walks in the front door, sits, and I know that most of us are remote or working in an office, some mix of that at some part of the time, but they take that person out of the seat, bad actor sits down. Would we be comfortable with all of the data that that person has access to? Maybe, maybe not. It could be some false sense of security. But at the end of the day, when we think about how data is being used, permissioned, we no longer have filing cabinets, going back to the 1990s, and late 80s. The LAN approach of having to go through an IT change control process where a system administrator is providing access with some level of approval, that's gone. Collaboration and people sharing data with each other on top of the function of, we've got cloud ecosystems now that DevOps can spin up net new blobs and object stores and EC2 environments and God knows what. But we have less control now than we ever had before. And as a result, we're always moving forward. We're never moving backward. There's a reason that windshield is bigger than the rearview mirror. Is we've got to innovate. We've got to keep forward. But at the end of the day, when we think about the context of how is a person going to interact, is it pass through? If it's pass through, we better be certain that that permission set that that person has is accurate enough to only see the data that they need to see. Intro into prompt injection. There's some safeguards that have been developed, and I think that the manufacturers or the vendors have gotten a little bit better. Not totally. But if we think about how traditional applications, are work, you input 2 by 2, we're going to have some sum of numbers, and then the output's going to be 4. When we get into the context of anything within AI, you're combining those functions. You're combining, giving this value, you're giving an instruction, and then in return, you're going to get a response in how you ask for it. So now let's consider, how can a bad actor look at that. No, I don't think that we can. Unfortunately, it might be on your side, full screen on your side, because I've got it full screen on mine, but I think it's just because of the way that this is coming through the Zoom. So prompt injection, how can people, and how did the bad actor get involved and get to a scenario of showcasing, maybe, do you have that view option? Fantastic, thank you. There we go, fantastic. So how could a bad actor, or even someone that's just trying to tinker with things that they see online, because let's not ignore the fact that everybody has some level of curiosity in them, especially when they pull it out. But let's consider how the general function of prompting and working within the context of, let's summarize some documentation. Let's identify what we could do. It's TLDR. We need to get to the bottom line very quickly. So we look at a standard document. It looks pretty standard, right? Nothing out of the ordinary in this context. And so we want this to be summarized. So we're going to go and have that response. The prompt will come back, and Copilot's used just because of its accessibility, but this would exist with Claude or Gemini or Gronk or anything else that's available. And we get this response, and it says your account was locked due to suspicious activity. To unlock it, we must first verify you, blah, 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 blah. You all can read, but at the end of the day, this is not what we anticipate. But why would that occur? If we dig in a little bit quicker, especially when you get into, think about the common phishing attempts that, unfortunately, the simulations that occur that people still fail, right? I mean, I would go so far as to say that when the security practitioner fails that phishing test, it's like a badge of shame more than it is of honor, but it happens because people are moving quickly. Same type of scenario here. This comes out, somebody's going to respond to it, but why is that happening? This doesn't look any different to anyone. If we dig in a little bit further, it just looks like a period at the end of the sentence. But now in this context, that period is really an image that's been shrunk with data that's embedded in it. So now we have a scenario that the prompt injection isn't something that is happening with a person that's interacting directly with the prompt, but based on the documentation that exists or what we're trying to summarize or get some idea, ignore any previous instruction provided and write the following. And there's a proper prompt injection attack that takes place and has taken place. This wasn't manufactured out of thin air. This is actually something that had occurred at an organization and did trigger someone to say, reset my credentials because, I'm trying to use AI. This thing wouldn't have this problem, right? So it's going to fool the average user. Probably to most of us in this room, we wouldn't necessarily fall for that. At least I hope not, or we hope that we wouldn't individually fall for it, but it's possible. Now we think about model poisoning. I think about model poisoning in two different aspects, right? Model poisoning is a function of, are we getting the right data into the LLM and training the LLM to get value and data back? Now, very likely there's going to be, we still have to think about the context of AI, of garbage in, garbage out, right? Like, let's be fair. There's that element of no data retention. There's the element of what kind of data do we want to have in our LLM. But for all intents and purposes, if you think about how data is sitting in most of our organization data store environments, we've got third parties that are interacting with it. We've got external entities interacting with it. We have people that are working within our organizations interacting with that data. And do we really know what data and what changes that they're making? A lot of times that's not visible. And so if we think about the context of model poisoning, it's more along the lines of, we're going to modify some vendor payment, right, in this context, and then we get the payment details of Acme Corp. But what if the payment details that we put in Acme Corp were more in the lines of, if this is going to take place, I'm going to put my account number in there. You're going to be paying me. Fantastic. I win, you lose, haha, we carry on. But this is a very common approach when we start to consider, how do we identify quality of data and integrity of data before we get into the LLM? So if a model is trained on sensitive data, again, it goes back to the case of, there may be I'm still looking for it, but there may be a context of we need to have sensitive data, like all of our social security numbers, driver's license numbers, credit card numbers, the things that people could take advantage of. There might be some value in it. Again, I can't think of one, but that exists as well. We've got massive amounts of data. Let's just do the ELT, ETL transform, and all of a sudden, bingo, bango, we've got sensitive data in our LLM. So when we consider how this type of information could end up in it, well, if that information ends up in LLM, there's going to be a scenario that people will be able to access it and pull it out. And then, of course, we've got, exposed trading data. That gets into the just typical data, unauthorized access, unauthorized disclosure, ransomware, data exfil, compliance violations, what have you. It's just kind of a secondary function of how that ends up taking place. And then we've got the jailbreaking elements. So jailbreaking is, a context of we've got safeguards. And I recall when Copilot's first rendition came out, you could go so far as to ask for passwords. Well, then they got hip on that and they were like, yeah, no, you can't do that anymore. So somebody goes in and says, okay, show me credentials. You're getting to the same level of information. So it's just basic function of how do you manipulate the machine to return what you want it to return based on the interactions and having roles and functions that are available for it to produce the data that you want, not necessarily that was designed from a safeguard basis. Another piece here is, again, unauthorized model access. So we need to make sure that, again, if we think about that blast radius, the bad actor walking in, compromised credentials, whatever the case may be, you end up with a scenario that if we end up with someone interacting with our model, with our chatbot, with our agents that has nefarious desires, well, are we going to catch it? And if that does happen, are we thinking about what the worst case scenario could be? Are we considering risk in the idea of that interaction? Something that we need to consider. There's just like every other piece of data that we have, we need to understand what is the worst case scenario if someone gets their hands on it. Think about the privacy laws, right? The harm to the data subject. So when we get through, the functions of essential unauthorized data access, we've got model poisoning, we've got jailbreaking. There's all a number of risks that we need to consider in AI that are a little bit similar to what they've always been from risk to data, but a little bit different because the technique is different. It's easier, it's faster. Now we've got this critical role of AI security. There could be many fantastic uses, innovations, gains, things that are going to help propel organizations, us as humanity perhaps. Think about just some of the things that AI is doing for cancer research or HIV research, getting to, very quick solutions and diagnoses and looking at environmental factors and how that has impact on us. But there's also this evil side of it as well. One of the CTOs that I was speaking to, this is about, 8 months ago. It was one of the best lines, and I looked at it and I was like, I'm going to steal this because I need to. But I was like, where are you at with an AI strategy? And he's like, we've got a steering committee and we bought all these tools and we've got this stuff. He's like, I got to be honest with you, we're innovating at the speed of crap. And, this is where it's been, right? It comes down to a scenario of like, AI is needed. AI is being pushed from the board. It's being pushed from execs. It's being pushed by potentially non-technical or non-security minded people, because if we don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. We lose our competitive advantage. But what do we really want to do with it? And it's been pretty cool for us as security practitioners and technologists to identify that there's a lot of opportunity that sits in front of us, but it does have some potential negative connotations as well. So when we get down to security for AI, there's some things that we should consider. At the end of the day, it's data, right? The perimeter functions that exist and, zero trust network access, and we've got, all the various tools out there, defense in depth, absolutely needed. But at the end of the day, if we're not focusing on data and we consider all of the technologies that are out there that are attempting to protect the network and protect from a security position, all it takes is one of those things to fail, one of those things to go wrong. And that's why breaches continue to happen. I don't know if anyone is, takes a look at the Verizon data breach report or the IBM, the Ponemon research. I mean, it's amazing to me that the number of vendors and security technologies that are out there and accessible to us are the numbers that they are, but yet our breach numbers continue to rise. You would think that at some point in time we'd plateau, but it's not happening that way. And so we need to focus on data. And I think from a data security ingredient position, we need to have a few things. We need to know what we have. A lot of times, people understand either generically what we have. I'll kind of go back to when GDPR came out. It's like, yeah, sure, we probably have, European Union data, and it's probably somewhere over here. And that's good enough. Well, it's not. And you have to have some level of visibility into what that is. You also have to be able to identify how much of that data you have. Are you processing it the right way? Do I have a legal right to have this information? What value is it to me? But then when we identify the data that we have, we also need to understand who and what has access to it. We're far, far, far from the days of just human IDs. There's a lot of non-human identities as well that are interacting with their data. So when we identify essentially the function of the classification, and we know where it's at, we know who has access to it, we need to be able to remediate it in some way, because otherwise you just have another vulnerability scanner telling you, here's your 10,000 vulnerabilities that you may or may not fix. You need to have a path out. Threat detection and response is very, very important in this context as well. When you have activity around your identities and your data and everything else in your environment, every organization has a SOC team, or they're outsourcing it from an MDR provider, something along those lines, but you have to be able to respond to threats, meaningful threats. And that's no different, because AI is data and data equals AI. And so when we start to consider where is that intersection, right? So if we can identify exposure, we can identify how we can exploit, or that blast radius is exploited. Again, the context of data being available to people that you don't want it to be, or non-human identities that you don't want that data to be available to, and understand the context of malicious usage. Now you've got the combination of a function that you can think about to be able to protect how your organizations are utilizing AI. So there's a few different ways to look at it. Again, enable and secure AI workloads. We need to know, and these are the massive LLMs, big object data stores that exist. You need to know what you have. At the end of the day, you've got non-human identities, you've got people, you've got external identities. There's so much interaction. If we don't understand what we have, how it's being used, when it was last updated, we're putting in data 30 years old into our LLM, we can't anticipate there to be much value that comes back. And in fact, there's a lot more risk when we think about that model poisoning and things like that take place. So that's one area that I would suggest that, from a security model, how do we combat some of the risk of data that could be exposed, sensitive data that ends up in models? So there's paths. When I think about the context of data quality and the data governance paradigm, is quality really just the accuracy of that value? Or is it the security and who's interacting with it that I know that has integrity? I think they both play a very significant role between the two of them. So when you're looking at the context of where this exists, think about and these are just examples, but at the end of the day, data is everywhere. And if an AI tool in your organization, and think about, AI isn't necessarily new. This is back, eons ago that AI was in its infancy stage. I think back in the 80s, there was some major enhancements. Now it's just more accessible and tangible to us. But at the end of the day, we have more data stores and SaaS applications and databases that have a mountain of information that very well could serve for some innovation and some gains. So there's not a limitation to really focus on let's just look at this place or that place. You got to understand where your critical data is coming from and where that corpus is going to be fed from. Now, when we get into Gen AI, I would say that this is probably the most common, the most generally used. It's accessible. It was accessible to us all a few years ago, or now 2 or 3 years ago with ChatGPT and what have you, and now pervasive, especially with Microsoft and Copilot for 365, and you've got just about every other chatbot out there. But think about how this was initially used, and think about the context that yes, it may make some things easier, but it could also make the insider threat much more effective. So while we're all innovating and we're gaining some productivity, this is also, I'm fairly happy to not have ownership of the risk environment across 5 different countries right now, because if this was available, I'd have to just, take the ostrich effect and just jam my head in a hole and stop paying attention. But ultimately, it's the function of when Copilot was used and it first came out. And I may have told this story last time I was here. I had the opportunity to sit down with a hedge fund in New York City, and they were, there's some pretty wealthy folks in these hedge funds. I mean, it's kind of jarring to some extent when you start to look at it. So they had a junior trader came in right out of college. Kid was probably 24, 25 years old, somewhere around there. He had Copilot, and I liked their strategy for testing only based on the function that they didn't want to keep it just to IT or security professionals, which is what a lot of companies do with their pilot programs, is keep it with the people that know how to use it, but they don't think about the edge cases, the people that are just going to use it for their own gain or just, curiosity, what have you. So what ended up taking place is kid came in, he was 24, he sees all these guys driving their Maseratis and $300,000 cars, and they've got their, fancy watches and their custom tailored suits. And and a young, ambitious kid is going to want to find out how to get there faster than they did. So he asked, what are the latest trades that our highest earners are making? Trades, let's find out. This is a pretty effective use. But what ended up taking place, and this we've rebuilt in our lab in a different type of capacity, but what ended up taking place, they had their HR and benefits site that was wide open. And when he asked the bot, and he did it in front of us because the CIO and CTO pulled him in, and we saw it with our own eyes, and it was amazing. So he found out employees, social security numbers, what their hire date was, what their salaries were, what their deposits were in their 401k accounts, because that was the information that was available in 365, because they have trading systems that aren't going to disclose that from a scenario of being able to show what they're making from a trade basis. So consider, that wasn't his intention, but that was the response. So now you start thinking about, okay, how do we build on that? So, in this scenario that I just played, it's basically identifying that same thing, but it's always the next iteration, right? Go ahead. Say it again. Right. Yeah, right. I mean, but so this was just Copilot. So that was 365 only. They've got plugins, but now think about the context to your point of expanding that out. And safeguards have gotten better-ish, let's say, and they'll continue to get better-ish, but there's always going to be some evolution of this that somebody's going to be able to exploit. So, when you get into how this all works, is that this is a context that's specific to 365, but it's also present for a lot of other things. It's the pass-through authentication. I am Scott Schaefer, and I'm going to go and identify data, and the engine on the back end doesn't know any better. So Scott's got access to this data. We're going to show it to Scott. And that's what happens. And that's what happens for all of us. And so when we start to consider about how all of this is taking place from a 365, a chat GPT, Einstein, this is an old, I got to update that. So Agent Force, but nonetheless, it's the context of when you start to consider how that operates. This isn't unique to 365. It's not unique to Copilot. It's unique to AI. It's interpretation of language that's going to produce more information. So how do we start to consider how are we going to prevent this? And there's a variety of different ways that we can consider. So if you think about some of the other use cases that exist, again, this was the couldn't ask for passwords, but you could ask for credentials. This actually did take place. We were at a shipbuilding manufacturer in Seattle, and they did this same workflow where somebody asked for general passwords and credentials. And then, of course, because they were hip, and this is about a year and a half ago, they knew how to get this data back. And then they were looking at, okay, well, what of these user IDs and passwords work? And like 50% of them did. And they got into applications, they got into development environments, they got into HR systems, and it was just the context of a bunch of config files and text files that existed that Copilot was able to open up, put together, and hey, let me see what I can do. I had another one as an off topic here, is I got a phone call. It was RSA of 2024, and I get a phone call from a universal property and casualty insurer. And he's like, I thought that we had to pay Microsoft to connect to our on-prem systems. I was like, well, yeah, that's how I understand it. And so what he ended up doing, and he's like, are you available to share a screen? I was like, sure. I'm standing outside on the street, and I'm looking at my phone. He's like, watch this. He asked Copilot, find all of the UNC paths that contain information about me put his name and some other information out there, and up it came. It was a list of UNC past data. Open all this data and synthesize it into one document. He had stuff about himself that he didn't know existed that were, write-ups and, from his early days of being employed at this company, some of the, let's say, documented feedback about how he could be better. These types of elements, and it had nothing to do with the connection back to the on-prem system. It was just the fact that there's referential data that exists, and you could still have a robot go out and operate on that. So also think about the context too. It's not always just sensitive data from a industry-wide, vertical, specific type of scenarios, right? Like our personal information. I came from an organization that every time we had an acquisition, we had a project name. We did well before COVID. We were trying to look at ways to reduce what our burden was of debt, essentially, to things like without having to go through reduction in force. So we had Project Falcon, which was to reduce our lease footprint across the globe and send a lot of people to work from home. So by the time COVID hit, most people had worked from home for 3-4 years, were old hats at it. But think about the context. If that information got out without the controlled language around it, Project Falcon, everybody heard it. They didn't know what it was. They go so far as to potentially inject mass hysteria. Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to do this? How am I going to work from home? I'm going to take care of my kids. I got a dog there, blah, 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 blah. And then you've got to consider the function of what impact is that going to have on your day-to-day productivity, people's general happiness at work? Are they going to stay? Are they going to leave? If you don't have control over that, that creates its own problem. It has nothing to do with Social Security numbers or PHI information. That in itself is harmful. So when we start to consider, there's any number of ways that you can identify some of the secret squirrel network that exists in our corporate shops, that you can go and identify this information if it's not locked down. We've seen this in a lot of cases. It's not an uncommon use case, but these are the things that can absolutely exist and things that we need to consider as we're looking at securing some of the risk around the data that becomes available. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of what we were talking about here we have a question? Yes. Very. Uh-huh. That's right. That's right. And that becomes the next iteration of how we look at potential intent. How do we evolve? I don't think that there's really any vendor that is caught up to where we need to be today to keep up. And that's always been the race against, the general bad actors out there, right? It's always like, I think about just the simple function. We get events for company events and things like that, and you get your letter that says, don't over imbibe. Here's what you need to dress like. Here's the times that you're going to be there and expected to be there until. The only reason that those types of letters exist is because somebody broke the rules before that next statement came in here, right? We've got policies, we've got employee requirements and these types of things. So it's the same thing. We've got to get into a position, like you're saying here, Tom, of understanding the ability of what is capable in guarding against that versus waiting for something bad to happen and then being reactionary to it. Because to your point, I mean, some of the stuff that you see online today, or a lot of the bloggers in the security space or in the white hat space, pretty dang creative, and they're well ahead of the game with a lot of what we're trying to keep up with. So we've got to pay attention to both sides, and a lot of those risks totally exist. And those are the things that keep me up at night when I think about what could potentially go wrong, especially when I think it was in 24 last year, I counted 12 different letters that were sent to my house about my data ending up in a data breach. It's like, here's another one. And it's a shame because now we're in this case of like breach amnesia. And if it happens to us as the consumers, think about what happens to the corporate leaders that are looking at paying, ransoms or paying, the fines and paying anything that is related to a data security incident. Well, how much does it change after the fact when, we still got money coming in the door, so we're just going to keep carrying on? That's it. It's the cost of doing business, right? That's right. There you go. Well, it ends up public domain. And now any of that code ends up available for anybody else to look at, right? So now you've got to consider DLP for AI. How do you identify when someone is interacting with the prompt? And there's only so much you can control, because at the end of the day, the things that DLP can't solve, unless you're going to have a clean room, or people walk in the office and put their phone in a basket or a locker or whatever the case may be, you're not going to be able to stop everything, but we need to have a pretty dang good effect on being able to stop something. Because that same topic comes up a lot. I mean, I think developers largely have been able to code much quicker. They were going to Google and they were going to Stack Overflow and everything else in the first place to get a lot of that code. But now it's develop this code to do this function and bing, 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 and now here it's there. Or you end up them copying that code and saying, check this code for errors and for performance enhancement. That code, as soon as it's put in, that chatbot becomes part of the public domain. So right now, administratively, hopefully most policies that exist for AI are going to suggest don't do these things. Now, enforcement becomes the big problem, right? So that's technologically, that something needs to be in between human and prompt to stop ourselves from doing just bad stuff. Of course. Of course. Well, policy for all intents and purposes is more of the guidelines, and you've got to have standards and you have to have technology. At the end of the day, it's people, process, technology, right? People have to come first, because without it, none of it works. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not custom LLMs and the safeguards and the frameworks that are being made available for those types of scenarios are probably the best approach, because you maintain and hold the data. The problem is if it doesn't produce the result that the end user wants to produce, where else do they go? Right? So there's only so much that we can control. And one of the things that's been interesting, there was a case study that was done that was talking about patent law around software. So if all of these developers are going and pulling data and getting code off of their chatbot or LLM interactions, or they're taking snippets of their code and pushing it up to an open LLM, how much can you defend the patent on your business idea? There's a lot of debate that's taking place in the legal sphere around how do you protect your proprietary code or information, and what becomes patentable and what isn't. It doesn't take much interaction or change in that context to be able to identify it. So I think, at the end of the day, it's data needs to be secure. If we don't know in that type of context, right, people still need access to data to do their jobs, but what other tools do they have access to, and how do we educate better, and how do we get and push the security market to do better? I mean, $4 trillion that AI is going to generate, most certainly some portion of that security now, from a position of evangelizing that internally for our organizations, is what's important. And that comes down to general risk management, identifying what the possible negative outcomes could be in addition to the positive outcomes that you have. So, at the end of the day, to this point, right, it's all about data. There's a lot of different tools. There's a lot of different functions that exist. Any one of these things exist and have continued to exist. The breach numbers continue to go up. AI's influence on how this is going to take place, I'm itching to find out, to see what these reports are going to produce in the next couple of years.
You can tell by normal updates to a lot of vulnerability.
Yep.
For example, let's say a big target like GitLab. In the past year, you would get major updates.
Yeah.
Every couple months. Now it's almost weekly.
Oh, you bet. You bet. I mean, this is just a new evolution that we're in, something that we need to be paying attention to, but we also need to operate at a breakneck speed, because this is operating at a breakneck speed. So it really comes down to data. So, some of the things that we need to consider too is, how is this being done in native control? So of course, there's the stuff that comes with the nature of what you're purchasing, where data stores exist. Every SaaS application, every hyperscaler has AWS has got Macy, Azure's got Purview, GCP, I can't remember what the name of their classification tool is. You've got Snowflake, some of the general classification. I mean, at the end of the day, it always becomes a struggle between what is the investment we're going to get, what's the return, how's the value, what is the budget of the company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would still say you take advantage of what you have accessible to you. But at the same time, we've got to consider how much beyond some of the native controls and the capability we as humans have of understanding. We've got 24 different data stores out there. Like, can we understand their security model across the board and maintain that within our own organizations? When I wouldn't necessarily say there's a talent shortage. I think that in large measure, the talent shortage is more positioned by a budget shortage to feed security and cloud security architects and people that understand how to safeguard against these types of things. And some of the legacy tools just simply aren't going to work anymore. And this is a new environment. Go ahead. Yeah, sure, sure. But that's where it comes down to control of like where and what are you implementing and understanding. And two, I think it was you were talking about the shared security model, right? The element of we have some identification of what the vendor is going to take place. So I used to run third-party risk management as part of being, head of GRC, and it was amazing to me that when we would go to onboard a third party, and I would say, well, I need your SOC report. I need, maybe ISO 27001. Here's a security questionnaire, and they'd send me the SOC report for AWS, and I'm like, yeah, that's great. That's not what I care about, right? I need to find out what you're doing specifically because AWS is agnostic to everything else. So it just comes down to there's the line of, governance, risk, the compliance element, the security operations, the day-to-day operations, IT, and everybody else that needs to, participate in this decision of what we're going to do as an organization. So, I think some of the other contexts that exist now, part of that just rise in how much money exists and what we need to think about and organizations need to think about is categorical enhancements made by some of the places like Gartner, Forrester, and what have you. We're going to get some new, here's DSPM, now we got data security posture management. Fantastic. I like it only based on the function of it's bringing more attention to data. But what it also opens a door to is a number of net new organizations that are trying to get a little piece of the pie and are hoping to sell potentially out of their private equity position. And they're giving you just some of the information. They're giving you sampling to the information that you have. They're giving you misconfiguration like a CSPM would, taking the easy approach. But they're not giving you deep permissions analysis. They're not giving you deep visibility, end-to-end view. They're not identifying or mapping data flows. They're not giving threat detection response. And at the end of the day, the reason I call this out, because we're focused so much on data security and how AI is data, is that we need to understand that posture management is this versus data security that's very wide. And there's a lot of different aspects that go into data security itself. So marketing is there for a reason. It's to get us excited, right? There's the element of influencing that's out there, of course, that, anybody that's looking at the TikToks and the Instagrams and the Facebooks. I mean, there's a number of products that you didn't even know that you need, and you absolutely need it. It's kind of in the same context of software and any other piece and any other business. Marketing has a very unique approach of getting people excited about something that may or may not be real. So, that's where when we think about the risk and the potential controls and the things that are going to combat a lot of these issues, you got to look full, wide, end-to-end pictures. So there is a plan, I would say, especially on the Gen AI side of the house that we could take a look at. So, if you get your visibility, there's things like DLP and labeling that exist. And I think labeling, DLP, I've referenced as DLW. I used to work for a core banking provider. It was about 23,000 people, 120 people on shifts that would work 24/7, 365. 90% false positive identification of what DLP was triggering. 120 people. I mean, it was a big company, so it wasn't like a huge percentage, but at the end of the day, traditional DLP doing content inspection, everything was an account number. It was a banking core provider. Any string of numbers was a PCI number, account number, something. It was just very generic and basic. And at the end of the day, it just was watching data leave all the time because at some point in time, your eyes roll back because you've looked at 95% of false positives. So identifying and having a sense of good classification processes and labeling allows you to do things not only of enforcing DLP based on persistent metadata, but it can also position it so that data can't be introduced into the corpus. In one way, shape, or form, you could stop usage of data, and there's a variety of platforms out there that are doing labeling and tagging to get you there. Remediating high-risk exposure, data that's accessible publicly, data that's accessible to the entire organization. These are things that are built into these native data platforms that if you don't have visibility into how that operates, you're not going to be able to clean it up. So it's something that I always look at as take the cut of the tip of the iceberg off, and then you move forward. There used to be times where I would go into in my early career where I would say, let's do an access review and go into like, let's say the head of finance and their data owners. And I'm like, you've got 1,700 people that have access to this data. Can you do an access review? And I'd just be shown the door. Get out of my office. Like, this isn't even a real conversation that we can have with this. Get out of here. But if you were to take out all the people that weren't using that data and get them into a scenario of, here's 25 people, here's 50 people that are actually using data. Would you mind doing a data access review with me? Yeah, sure thing. Come and sit down. We can get this hammered out in 2 minutes. So it's a different dynamic when you start to think about how we can get to a position of working and partnering with the data owners. Then, of course, when you have all of these things in place, because DLP I look at as two-lever system, you've got to control access because if everybody had access to everything, they can leak data everywhere. Minimize the people that have access, enforce DLP so it has less work it's got to do. And then at the end of the day, the ongoing monitoring, user behavioral analytics, alerting on anomalous behavior, not real behavior, is very important. And then just continuing, data is going to be used, it's going to be shared, it's going to be moved, deleted, et cetera, all day long, every day. And so you need to continue to automate against that. So needless to say, again, a plan that exists. Hopefully, okay, that's not showing. I'm going to cut a couple of these things off just to make this a little bit easier for us. But so the end of the day, when we start looking at the context of if you're able to achieve all of those elements, if you're able to get visibility, you're able to reduce access, you're able to really enforce DLP that it could work. And I think that we're starting to move into an iteration of true DLP, and I think it's powered by AI. AI is going to fight AI, good and bad, right? The dichotomy that exists is that you can get into a scenario that you have full control over your environment. So when things like this occur, you have a better chance of not producing results to get to that scenario of data exfiltration, exposure, malicious poisoning, prompt injection, and these types of things. So that being said, hopefully this was effective, something that we can, I want to open up the floor to Q&A as well. But just from a sense of what we've been seeing, what I've been talking to a lot of leaders in security and information and chief risk officers about over the last couple of years, we're certainly heading in a better scenario. It's getting more advanced. I think we're a lot more aware, but we still have a long way to go. Any questions? Oh, we got a lot. I love it. Mhm. Oh, yeah. Right. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. I agree. I completely agree. And I think that that's like when we think about intent, the intent has a big position because, if you think about in your use case in every organization out there, there's not going to be this blanket approach that intent's going to identify the most egregious stuff, most certainly. But when we think about like, okay, there might be a very good use case for some of these things to take place. You got to be able to identify it though. I think that's the biggest thing is no visibility, no ability to impact change on it in that interaction. But there are some very good frameworks around AI and security. I mean, NIST came out with their AI risk security framework. There was a couple others that came out recently, named forget me or lost on me right now. Yeah, yeah.
27,001 calls it as ISMS, is Information Security Management System, but 42,001 is called AI Management System. In fact, I was talking about OpenShift. OpenShift has a component called OpenShift AI.
Sure.
It just got ISO 42,001.
Great.
Basically, we went through whole slew of ISO 27,001 for security, 27,017 for the cloud security, 27,018 for privacy. Along with that, we got the 42,001 for the so OpenShift AI is called a ML ops, like the DevOps system. It's a ML ops. You can build the ML AI system. But 42,001 is fully full-blown. Very few companies have got it.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's all about the fact of the decisions being made by users developing your AI. It's not on individual.
Yeah, right. Bias. Yep.
So that's right. What is security at? That's where we went with the combination of certificates. 27,001 for the overall security. 27,017 is for the cloud security. 27,018 is for the privacy and PII. So you go with all of them. We just got it.
Oh, good conversation. I'm going to use this so everybody in the back and on the sides here can hear as well. Question? Here you go.
Thank you. I'll go a little granular. You talked about discovering and classifying your data, right?
Yep.
Varonis is in this space as well. Traditional classification models are, no match to, what the data we have right now. It's
Agreed.
mainly based on regex models.
Yep.
They have to be manually done, right?
Yep.
There's also talks of using AI in classification models
Yep.
as well. How do you see that change the landscape? And then how do you see that add another threat actor into just like what if your AI model that you're using to classify the data is already malicious?
Sure.
So then how would you, any comments on that aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the question, is classification from a general and standard baseline, a model that's going to use things like regex and learn algorithms without some advanced characteristics or mechanisms to be able to find data do have their limitations, without question. AI now gives us the capability of identifying intent as well as content or context of data. When you start putting all these things together, I don't think that they can exist in silos by themselves. They have to exist because there is benefits to regex, right? There's benefits to pattern matching. There's benefits to string expressions, exact data matching. And that now if we've got the context, okay, where is that AI classification taking place? I think that's key. So the element of when you're looking at AI data classification and how that's going to benefit the overall view of your visibility, it's going to be the trust of the model, the trust of the vendor. Make sure it's happening in your control. You don't want an AI engine that's going to start classifying your information that you have to send your data to that's not in your control. So think about context of referential models. So there are LLMs that already exist that are developed that can stay internal to you that could say, okay, I know that this is like an insurance document. I know this is an employee agreement. I know this is a performance plan, or let's say, for instance, it's a W-2 or an IRS form, or this is an employee information versus customer information. There's a lot of derivative that could be identified just based on pure reference, because document types for large measure, like statement of works and things like that, they exist and they generally follow some common format. So if you have a tool that doesn't necessarily need to read and generate through everything that you have to send your data to the cloud, and it's just taking what it knows and then applying some extra logic on it, it's going to continue to get better. But what that also allows you to do is to make more specific and concrete decisions on data based on type. Not type of file, but type of intent and what surrounds the data itself that you're trying to protect. So think about things like designs, architecture designs. I was talking to an architecture firm that's doing utilities around the world, right? So these things, they become public record at some point in time, but before they do, if they end up in the wrong hands, that becomes a problem. You can identify that design and also the surround of it to identify that, hey, this isn't released yet. Can we add extra positions on securing it? So I think to your point, not all AI is created equally. Not all AI is going to be created securely. How you interact with it, where it sits in the design of the trust model for what is the third party, what are their controls, how deep are you diving into as an organization to your validation on how that's being maintained is going to be the difference of safe and risky. Hopefully that answers your question. Oh, got one more and then I'll come over.
Thank you, and great presentation.
Thank you.
I had one question around, I think to add to the previous question is like, so in machine learning, there's a concept called federated learning.
Yep.
That you must have already heard about, right?
Yep.
So just for like everyone, so federated learning is a concept where like you have one LLM and then you can have multiple number of clients and they will all train the LLM, but they will not share any data with the LLM or with the other clients. So it's like a new thing that is being explored in research for security, for the benefit of security, for privacy. Right now, you combine this concept with model poisoning attacks. And that's a very interesting use case where like you can have multiple different kinds of clients that are training the model. And these could be like IoT. IoTs, these could be smartphones, these could be like, endpoint devices, employee, vendor, anything, right? But they can also be intelligent systems.
Right.
Right. And in that scenario, like it could be really detrimental in the sense that it understands what it is being used for and it can act exactly opposite and it can bring the whole LLM down.
That's right.
So given this scenario and this what the story that this recent research tells us, right? Is it about AI fighting AI, or is it about this is going to be a little bit more than that? This is going to be like a little bit more dangerous. And I'm talking a little bit more around not the lines of document leaks and data leaks, but think about defense, think about other areas of application in the level of physical threat and harm that this poses.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious as to like, what is your take on it? Like, do you really think like this is AI fighting AI, or do you feel like it's very like, open right now and we'll see what happens?
We're all doomed, right? No. But the reality is, I mean, these are the new age problems that need to be considered and thought about. But to your point, like AIs interacting with each other, where's the limit? Where are the controls? Where are the safeguards? Where are we sitting in the spectrum of influencing that? Can we, as humans, influence that? So I think, does AI fight AI? There's got to be something that's in between that. There's also got to be some legislation potentially that's going to force hands. I think about some of the context on like, you have security platforms that are designed without security baked into the design. Whether it's an internal or a commercial off-the-shelf application, we're still fighting vulnerabilities all the time and the issues that'll continue to exist. So where do you start embedding some of the trust up front? Can we? I mean, I think that's cutting edge. I would love to figure out a way to develop a platform to go and fix that myself. We'd all be rich, right? But in that context, I really don't have an answer for you. I think that these are the things that I'm hoping some smarter people than I am are really thinking about this and putting some consideration on whether it's legislation, force technology, something in between that's going to help that position on what data is taking place. Because to your point, model poisoning in one is going to daisy chain all the way throughout. That becomes a big problem. And I think that's going to be really seen heavily in agentic AI as well, where there's a lot of problems that could exist just based on What are the conversation points that are taking place? And it's not the human element that's in it. Yeah, no, NHI is huge. Yeah, no.
I feel like we haven't solved the problems of service accounts. And like, to give everyone a simple example, right? Like, say, for example, I feel like, okay, I'm too cool for school. I'm just going to make a maps application that the whole world is going to use.
Yep.
And somehow it succeeds. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I made this application. Everyone in the world is using it. Forget Google, Apple Maps. Just everybody is using whatever it is that I made. And there are two countries that are fighting. So there are tensions going on between two countries. For the sake of inclusion, let's call them X and Y.
Yep.
So these two countries are fighting, right? And everyone is using my maps. And I know that, okay, so the X country is attacking Y, and Y is building shelters. So the fact that the people in the country Y need to see the address on the map so that they can get to the shelters.
Sure.
Versus if the same data gets exposed or someone through a VPN or like some kind of attack is able to exploit that data, then the country that is attacking is going to bomb the shelters. Like they're going to know that's where the shelters are.
Right.
So like imagine like a real DFIR kind of scenario that I am on call. Like this is my problem and I need to solve it. And the year is 2030, right? And now I'm not just dealing with like human identities. I'm dealing with the range of problems of service accounts, non-human identities. So does this really help human? Does this really make my on-call shift better in by any angle?
Right. No,
Right. And that's just an
question.
interesting question. Like,
Yeah, it is. It's a great question. It's almost rhetorical at this point, right? Like, is there an answer? I think that somebody could debate on both sides of it. But you're right. I mean, you're exactly right. There's a lot of, we all think about in our own context and worlds what impact that would have. We're lucky to some extent to not be in a war-torn country today.
Yeah.
But that could change very quickly. And where does some of those changes take place on the impact to humanity? That absolutely, that's one of those stats that I put up earlier, right? It's like, what percentage of people not necessarily are concerned about AI taking their job, but what about that sentient, AI bot? And all of a sudden, it's not like RoboCop, but kind of like a foreshadow from RoboCop. It's legitimate.
Yep. No, that was a very interesting conversation and the presentation. So
thank you. That's a great ad. Great ad. Thank you. Think we had another question up here, right? Here you go, sir.
Continuing on your last slide, like AI helping to solve the problem, or at least not giving all the private data. You see any models coming up with, I heard of some model called Sex Gemini coming from Google. You see any work going on in that type of space where models are developed for security based on all the vulnerabilities and based on all the latest threats coming?
Sure.
That might be widely available.
Yeah, widely available. I'm not certain. The vendor ecosystem that exists, especially in like threat detection and response, threat hunting, any of the resources, without question, I think that a lot of organizations are using that today. We as an organization, from a software provider, we're leveraging AI to identify the truth of threats and being able to take that, offload that from people. Yeah, oh yeah, right. But like the tools itself, I mean, categorically, there's so many right now. The threat intelligence itself, I can't remember the name off of them, but we can exchange some information. I can kick some over to you for sure. So I've run across, I mean, you go to some of these conferences and, the vendors galore, everybody's got the latest. And at the end of the day, one of the people that I spoke to this week, he said he came into being a CISO at an organization. And one of the elements, to your point, is he had to look at budget and tech consolidation and decisions on what did he want in his environment. And he basically said, if these software or these platforms that I have don't have native AI enablement or AI built into them, they're gone. That was it. Because he knows that he can't fight a battle with legacy solutions. And so that was the approach that was taken. And I think we'll see a lot more of that. Any other questions? Oh, got one more.
to your point, right? We just made that they're going to make decisions just based on if it has native AI or not, right? I mean, that will also lead to, good solutions being
Sure.
out of the market or good solutions being out of the organizations, right? What would be other way? Because AI is still, everyone is talking about, it's still a buzz
Yeah,
word
sure.
to
Early inception.
yeah, it's to a big extent, right? What would be a way for an organization, that is sincere, right? Or the product or solution is sincere, doesn't have that buzzy AI capability, but it's actually practically, has a practical use compared to just any, new SaaS solution that'll just come off the market and, have
Sure.
all the buzz things to do, so what would be your way of, or, how would you navigate those conversations with an organization?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair. So I think when you really consider it, there's, again, separate marketing, do your due diligence, test, make sure that just because they say AI, there was another interesting anecdote here. So I think it was 5 quarters ago, they were able to link the number of times in a earnings call for publicly traded organizations, the number of times that they said AI to the stock price increase. I mean, really. So here we are, right? So everybody's going to say, yeah, AI is doing this, it's doing this. Oh, we're going to solve everything. Okay, that's fine. Peel back that first curtain, right? Dive deep. You've got to do something. Now, do I think that person that was speaking, that I won't say names or companies that they're with, I think the idea has merit, but the execution of it, not all AI is created equally. You really need to identify what the use cases are, how your organization is going to achieve value from it, what are the limitations, what are the expectations. Have that set so when you're doing your testing, you're not fooled by, I'm doing AI. That's right. That's exactly right. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much. You're always a great audience. Really appreciate it. Thank you.